This image was taken a few years ago and it's one of my most successful images. It's been printed to 2.4 meters high at Christchurch International Airport and used quite a few times in homes as a decor image. I'm going to describe how I got the image and my approach to processing the raw captures. This video is broken down into 3 parts, so feel free to jump ahead using the chapter markers. So number 1, the planning and timing that went into capturing this image. Number 2, the technical details such as lens choice and exposure, and some general notes on the equipment used. Number 3, how I choose to process this image in Adobe Photoshop and Lightroom. To conclude this video, I'll give you 3 reasons why I think this image is successful and 3 tips to help you capture epic landscapes. I'll also share what apps and resources I find useful for planning landscape photo shoots. After a long 7-hour drive from Christchurch, I arrived to stormy weather in Milford Sound. Believe it or not, I'd actually planned it this way. By arriving during a storm, I had a really good chance of capturing some epic landscapes as the storm cleared. An evocative stormy atmosphere is particularly apt for Milford Sound, which gets 7.5 meters of rainfall on average per year, making it one of the wettest places in the world. The storm was gone the following day, but it dawned overcast and gloomy, and I was excited to see some snow on Mitre Peak. I decided to go for a drive and check out some photo locations back on the road towards Homer Tunnel. Around 9 AM I noticed the tourist boat, the Milford Mariner, coming in, probably from overnighting in the Sounds. If the boat went out again in the afternoon, it would be really good if I could find a higher vantage point to frame the boat with the water and the mountains in the background. Looking behind me at the bush-clad hills, I wondered if I could climb up and find a gap somewhere in the foliage. By the way, Milford Sound is not actually a sound. It was misnamed by early European explorers. A sound is typically formed by the flooding of river valleys, whereas a fjord is carved out by glacial activity, which is the case for Milford Sound. I decide to scrabble up in the afternoon for a look. I'm rewarded by one small gap that gives me a view. It's pretty steep, so I tie the tripod to my camera bag to keep it secure, and then I wait. Sometime after 4 PM, I notice that the sun's starting to poke through the clouds, and I also notice that the Milford Mariner is heading out. I double check my composition, focus, and camera settings and wait for the boat to be framed by the god rays as it heads down the fjord. I take 4 shots, moving the camera from left to right in order to stitch them together later in Lightroom. Why do I stitch together images instead of just taking a single wide-angle shot? Well, one reason is resolution. I can get a much larger printed image off a stitched image because of the number of pixels. Another reason is just composition. Often a landscape suits a panoramic format because that's pretty much how our eyes see the landscape anyway. I repeat the process of taking the 4 images a few times, and before long the boat's moved out of position anyway and my moment's gone. I knew I'd captured a pretty good image, but I decided to wait because the light was still nice and it looked like sunset might be quite promising. I get a few more interesting shots around sunset and then head down the hill, pretty happy with my day's work. I think it's important to show the processing of the image for a couple of reasons. Number 1 is I need to work with the image as a whole in Lightroom. And number 2, a lot of creative decisions are made in the processing. How light or dark do I want the image? What's the color palette? How much detail do I want in the highlights and in the shadows? With regards to the processing of images, I believe one of the best skills you can foster these days is restraint. It's very easy to overwork an image and have it looking quite punchy and oversaturated, which is fine if that's your aesthetic. For me though, I prefer an image to be believable and quieter and a bit more subtle, and sometimes that can take a bit of work to pull things back a bit. Processing an image can generally be broken down into 2 parts. Number 1, global adjustments, and number 2, localized adjustments. For the global adjustments, I want to start by stitching the image together and then apply some overall toning and coloring. I'll start by stitching the images together in Adobe Lightroom. They have about 33% overlap, which is ample for Lightroom to work with. And these days, I probably would have shot the images vertically, which would have given me a larger final image. Back in 2012, Lightroom was much more limited, so I would have done some corrections in Lightroom and then finished off in Photoshop. These days, Lightroom is much more powerful and I can do everything in Lightroom. So I've imported the images into Lightroom to stitch together. Let's have a look. You can see I've got the 4 images here and they overlap by about 1/3, which is plenty for Lightroom to work with. So I'm going to multiple select all 4 images, right click on one of them, go up to Photo Merge, Panorama. I'll choose Cylindrical because that's appropriate for a single row of images. And I'm going to choose Fill Edges to fill in the edges where it's distorted the images to get the overlap. Click OK. That'll take a few seconds. And here's the finished panorama, ready for tonal adjustments. So I'm going to head over to the Develop module and make some global and then some local adjustments. However, this is not really meant to be a Lightroom or processing tutorial. I just want to give you a quick overview to show you how much or how little I can do in the processing. So let's go into the Develop module now. So I'm in the Develop module. The first thing I want to do is just have a look at the image and see the main things that need to be addressed. And the main thing is the shadows. The shadows and the hills are quite black, quite blocked up. So I'm going to slide the shadow slider to the right. If I go too far, you can see it getting quite light in the shadows. I like to pull that back, keep it a little bit subtle. And if that has lowered the contrast a bit, which it has, I sometimes like to follow that up by sliding the black slider to the left to bring it a bit more black. I'm aiming to keep this histogram at the top here showing a complete coverage from highlights right through to deep shadows. Talking of the highlights, I'm going to also check and see whether the bright areas, the sun, is burning out or not, whether it's losing detail. I can do this by clicking the triangle at the top here in the histogram, and as I slide the exposure to the right, you'll see a big red area appear in the image. That just means that this area is completely without texture now, and that if you print this, it will just print as paper white. So that's something I want to avoid. If I'm looking into the sun, you can get away with a little bit of that burnt out area, but I certainly want to minimize it. So I'm happy with that. Now I want to have a look at the overall tone of the image. Is it too light, too dark? I think it's about right for our purposes, so I'll turn that triangle off. And it's time to look at some local corrections. So what I want to do is emphasize the boat in the middle to draw the eye in, and to emphasize those rays from the sun as well. So to do that, I'll go to the masking option, click on a radial gradient, and then drag a radial gradient in the area around the sun rays. I can click on the line on the outside of the gradient and rotate the mask. You'll see too it appears as a red preview on the screen. I can get rid of that by just adding an adjustment. So I'll brighten that area, and I want to add in a bit of warmth, so slide the temperature slider to the right, add a bit of yellow, not too far. And if I think that white is getting too bright there, I can pull down the highlights, just bring a bit of detail back into the clouds there. So that's probably about right. The last thing I can look at doing is using an effects slider called the clarity slider, which effectively adjusts the mid-tone contrast. It has the effect of making clouds or sun rays or things in the mid-tone really pop. So if I slide this clarity slider all the way to the right, you can see the effect there. But once again, I don't want to go too far, so I'll just pull that back a bit. It's about right. At this stage of working an image, I like to do a before and after, which I can do by hitting the Y key, and I can get an idea of whether or not I'm moving in the right direction or going too far, and I think that looks pretty good. I'd probably go away from the image for a while now, come back to it with a fresh eye, and make some further adjustments, or maybe print a test print. So in conclusion, this shot for me ticks the three things that make up a great landscape, and that is number one, a great composition, number two, beautiful lighting, and number three, gesture. And what I mean by that is a decisive moment or something happening in the image that kind of ties it all together. And of course, in this case, it's the boat moving through the scene. Now we could have a look at the scene without the boat in it, as you can see here, and it's still a fairly spectacular image, but nowhere near as the same impact as having that boat as the focal point. So some hot tips. Research and preferably visit the location if you can. If you can't visit, Google Maps and images are a good place to start. What's the access and parking like? Know what time sunrise and sunset are and how long it'll take you to get to the location. Number two, prep and know your gear. I find checklists are a good idea. There are so many little things you can miss, like memory cards or spare batteries. Familiarize yourself with the camera settings that you're likely to be using, because it's much harder to work things out when you're under pressure on location. Number three, time your visit. This goes back to point one. What time of day would be best for lighting? Do you need to consider tide times? What sort of weather would be best for the shots you're after? And overall, be patient. Sometimes you just need to wait for things to line up or weather to clear, or come back later if you can. Apps and resources. Apart from the ubiquitous Google Maps and images, there are really only a couple of apps I use all the time for landscape photo shoots. I use Windy for weather. It is the app that many pilots prefer, and I found it pretty reliable. It can forecast down to the hour and separates out high cloud, medium cloud, low cloud, and even fog, which is pretty useful for a landscape photographer. The other app is Sunrise. There are many sunrise, sunset apps on the market, and others will most likely do a similar job. The useful features in this app are being able to see sunrise and sunset for a location on any date overlaid on a map, and also as an overlay in your phone camera if you're on location. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.